He was sitting in a room full of people who had already made up their minds about him. Not a courtroom, not a battlefield. Just a room, with the kind of silence that only forms when everyone present has agreed, without saying a word, that someone does not belong there. One man leaned across the table and said it plainly: "Waste no time on her." He was not talking about a woman. He was talking about the idea that this young man, this nobody from nowhere in particular, could ever be worth the effort it would take to believe in him. His name was Thomas Fitzsimmons, and according to every person who knew him in the winter of 1812, he should not have mattered. He was the third son of a tenant farmer in rural County Clare, Ireland, at a time when being Irish, being poor, and being third in line for anything were three separate death sentences for ambition. He had no title. He had no inheritance waiting for him at the end of someone else's life. He had no mentor, no patron, no well-placed uncle who might whisper his name into the right ear at the right moment. He had a coat with 2 missing buttons and an accent that made educated men smile, the slow, patient smile of people who have already stopped listening. But before you can understand what Thomas did with all of that nothing, you need to understand the world he was born into. Rural Ireland in the early 1800s was not simply poor, it was architecturally poor, meaning the poverty was structural, designed, and enforced by centuries of deliberate policy. The land belonged to landlords who lived in England and collected rents through agents who had no particular reason to be kind. The church recorded births and deaths, the courts recorded debts. And in between those two certainties, a man like Thomas existed in a social category so fixed and so ancient that questioning it was not rebellious, it was simply incomprehensible. You did not rise from where he stood. You endured it, or you left, or you disappeared into the kind of quiet desperation that has no name because no one ever thought to name it. The men around Thomas had absorbed this truth so completely that they no longer experienced it as a truth at all. It was simply the air. It was simply the ground beneath their feet. His own father was not a cruel man or a stupid one. He was a man who had learned, as his father had learned before him, that the distance between ambition and humiliation was approximately the length of one outstretched hand. So he kept his hands at his sides. He worked, he endured, and he fully expected his sons to do the same. Thomas was 23 years old when the man in that room told the others not to waste their time on him. The occasion was a meeting of a small merchant cooperative in the town of Ennis, the kind of organization that existed somewhere between a business arrangement and a social club, and that admitted new members the way old institutions always admit outsiders, reluctantly, conditionally, and only when someone credible vouched for them. Thomas had no one to vouch for him. He had shown up uninvited, which, depending on your perspective, was either the most naive thing a man in his position could do or the most strategic. He had heard about the cooperative from a man he worked for, not as a confidant, not as a colleague, but as the person who swept the floor of his office on Thursday afternoons. He listened. He remembered. He walked through a door that was not meant for him, and the room told him, without ambiguity, to leave. Not violently, not cruelly, exactly, just with the particular efficiency of people who have places to be and no patience for distractions. "Waste no time on her," the man said, using the Irish idiom of the era, the phrase that meant do not invest, do not engage, do not allow yourself to be slowed down by something with no future. It was not personal. That was almost the worst part. It was not personal at all. Thomas Fitzsimmons was not disliked. He was simply categorized, filed, placed in the correct drawer, and closed away. He left the room. He stood in the street outside in the grey Clare morning, with the smell of peat smoke in the air, and the sound of a cart moving slowly over wet cobblestones somewhere behind him. And here is what he did not do. He did not accept it. Not with rage, not with grand defiance, not with any of the dramatic gestures that stories like this are supposed to contain. He simply stood there and decided, with a quietness that was almost frightening, that the categorization was incorrect, that the drawer was the wrong shape, that the people in that room were not wrong about the world they lived in. They were wrong about him specifically, and the difference between those two things was the only gap he needed. Can you feel the weight of that moment? Not the heroism of it, the loneliness of it. To stand in a cold street and decide, against all available evidence, that you are the exception. Not because you have proof, not because someone told you so, but because the alternative, acceptance, endurance, the slow disappearance into what was expected, was simply not something you were willing to do. That is not luck. That is not privilege. That is a choice, made in a grey street in 1812 by a 23-year-old man with a coat missing 2 buttons, and it is the same choice available to anyone willing to make it. But what Thomas did next is not what you expect. And to understand it, you first need to understand exactly how long he was willing to wait. There is a particular kind of wall that is more dangerous than any wall you can see. A visible wall can be climbed, broken, walked around, but a wall that has been painted to look like the horizon, a wall that every person around you has agreed to call the edge of the world, that is something else entirely. That is the kind of wall that does not need guards, because the prisoners have already convinced themselves there is nowhere else to go. That was the world Thomas Fitzsimmons was born into, and before you can understand what he did inside it, you need to understand exactly how it was built. Ireland in the early 1800s existed in a condition that historians call, with characteristic understatement, a dependent economy. What that phrase means in practice is this: the land produced wealth, and the wealth left. It crossed the Irish Sea in the form of rents, in the form of grain, in the form of cattle, and arrived in England as the comfortable income of men who had never once stood in an Irish field. The people who worked that land, who broke it, planted it, prayed over it, and buried their children in it, received in return just enough to continue working it. Not comfort, not security, just continuation. The system was not accidental. It had been refined over 2 centuries of colonial administration into something very close to a machine, and like all efficient machines, it did not require malice to operate. It only required compliance. Compliance, in a world like that, was not weakness. It is important that you understand this. The men and women who accepted the ceiling were not failures of imagination or courage. They were rational actors operating inside a system that punished deviations swiftly and completely. A tenant farmer who challenged his landlord did not become a hero. He became homeless. A laborer who demanded fair wages did not start a movement. He was replaced before the end of the week by someone hungrier. The social architecture of rural Ireland was specifically designed to make resistance too expensive for any individual to afford, which meant that the ceiling was not enforced by soldiers or courts alone. It was enforced by neighbors, by family, by the collective wisdom of people who had watched others try and fail often enough to know better. And into this world, Thomas was born third. That detail matters more than it might seem. The firstborn son in a tenant farming family in County Clare carried the family's continuity. He would work the land, inherit the lease, maintain the line. The second son was the insurance policy. The third son was, in the cold arithmetic of rural survival, a surplus. He was fed because he was present, and because his parents were not monsters, but the family's future was not organized around him. He would need to find his own arrangement with the world, which in practice meant he would become a laborer, a tradesman's apprentice, or, if he was unlucky and desperate enough, a soldier in someone else's army fighting someone else's war for reasons that had nothing to do with him. The remarkable thing is not that this system produced resignation. The remarkable thing is that it produced it so thoroughly, so universally, so completely, that the resignation did not even look like resignation anymore. It looked like wisdom. The men in Thomas's village who counseled acceptance were not cowards. They were the survivors. They had outlasted bad harvests and evictions, and the particular cruelty of landlords who raised rents the moment a family showed any sign of stability, as if prosperity itself were a provocation. They had learned the lesson that the system wanted them to learn, and they taught it to their sons with the genuine conviction of people passing on hard-won knowledge. Do not reach beyond your station. Do not attract attention. Do not give anyone a reason to look at you too closely. Stay small. Stay safe. Stay alive. Thomas had learned this lesson too. That is what people miss when they look back at men like him and decide they were always exceptional, always apart, always somehow immune to the gravity of their circumstances. He was not immune. He felt the weight of it. He understood, viscerally and practically, why the ceiling existed and why most men never touched it. The difference was not that he was unafraid. The difference was that he had developed, through some combination of temperament and observation and sheer stubbornness, a specific question that the world around him had no good answer to. Not a rebellion, not a manifesto, not a philosophy, just a question. And the question was simple: who decided? Who decided that the categories were fixed? Who decided that the merchant cooperative in Ennis was not for men like him? Who decided that the distance between a floor sweeper and a member was a distance that could not be crossed? Not God. God, as Thomas understood Scripture, had never expressed a particular opinion about merchant cooperatives in County Clare. Not the law. The law was silent on whether a man could walk through a door that was technically open. The only people who had decided were the people in the room. And people, Thomas had noticed, changed their minds when you gave them sufficient reason to. The world's rules, he was beginning to understand, were largely a matter of consensus, and consensus could be renegotiated. That insight sounds simple when you say it like that. It sounds almost obvious. But here is the thing about obvious insights. They are only obvious after someone has had them. Before that, they are invisible, hidden inside the certainty of a world that has been telling you the same story about itself for so long that the story and the reality have become indistinguishable. Thomas had found the seam where they came apart. What he did with it next would take 3 years, a great deal of patience, and one specific woman who, according to everyone around him, was not worth his time at all. Most people, when they are rejected, grieve the rejection. They turn it over in their hands like a stone, examining every surface, trying to determine exactly how much of it was their fault and how much of it was the world's cruelty. They spend weeks in that examination, then months, and somewhere inside those months, the original wound calcifies into something permanent, a belief, quietly adopted, that the rejection was correct, that the room full of people who said no were simply telling the truth about something they already suspected. Thomas Fitzsimmons did not do this. He went home, sat down at the small table where he ate his meals, and began to make a list. The list was not a list of grievances. It was not a list of enemies or of people who had wronged him. It was a list of everything the men in that room had that he did not. Not as an act of envy, but as an act of engineering. He wrote down capital, meaning actual money held in reserve. He wrote down reputation, meaning the accumulated record of transactions completed and promises kept. He wrote down language, by which he meant not English versus Irish, but the specific vocabulary of commerce, the way merchants spoke to each other, the terms they used, the shorthand of an industry he was standing outside of, with his face pressed to the glass. And then he sat with the list for a long time and asked himself, with genuine curiosity rather than despair, which of these things could be acquired. The answer, he concluded, was all of them. Not quickly, not easily, but none of them were qualities a man was born with. They were all, at their foundation, accumulated. Capital was accumulated through labor and restraint. Reputation was accumulated through consistency over time. Language was accumulated through proximity and attention. None of it required permission. None of it required someone to open a door for him. It only required time. And time was the one resource he had in the same quantity as every man in that cooperative, regardless of their station. 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. The great democratic fact of human existence, distributed without prejudice to the tenant farmer's third son and the merchant's heir alike. So Thomas waited. But here is what that word conceals, and what you need to understand clearly. He did not wait the way a man waits for rain. He did not sit in passive hope, looking at the sky and willing something to change. He waited the way a builder waits, actively, usefully, filling every interval with the specific work that the outcome required. He spent the first year doing something that looked, to everyone around him, like nothing at all. He read. He borrowed ledgers from the merchant whose floor he swept, and studied them in the evenings, not to steal, but to understand. He watched how prices moved with seasons. He watched how credit was extended and recalled. He watched how men who had money talked about risk, which turned out to be very differently from how men without money talked about it. In the second year, he shifted his attention from observation to relationship. He was careful about this, not sycophantic, not aggressive, but consistently present in the places where commercial life happened. He delivered messages when he could. He offered small, practical help without expectation of immediate return. He learned people's names, their children's names, the particular anxieties that kept certain merchants awake at night. Not to manipulate, Thomas was not a manipulative man, but because he understood, with a clarity that the men around him found slightly unnerving, that trust is not declared. It is accumulated. It is the sediment of 100 small, reliable acts, deposited so gradually that no single one seems significant until the day someone looks down and realizes the riverbed has changed. The third year was different. By the third year, something had shifted in how the town of Ennis experienced Thomas Fitzsimmons. He had not announced himself. He had not performed any dramatic gesture of self-promotion. He had simply continued, with extraordinary consistency, to be exactly what he said he was and to do exactly what he said he would do. In a commercial environment where promises were frequently optimistic and delivery was frequently approximate, this turned out to be genuinely unusual. People began to mention his name in contexts where it had not previously appeared, not with great enthusiasm, not yet, but with the quiet, almost reluctant acknowledgement that this particular man was, against all prior expectation, reliable. And then there was the woman. Her name was Catherine Moran, and she was the reason the men in the cooperative had first used the phrase that had sent Thomas into the street that grey morning 3 years earlier. Not because she was unimportant, because she was, in the estimation of every established merchant in Ennis, a losing proposition. Her father's textile business had accumulated debts that most men considered unsurvivable. Her family's reputation in commercial circles was the reputation of people who had reached too far and fallen too publicly. The consensus was clear. Whoever attached themselves to the Moran business attached themselves to its failure. Waste no time on her, on them, on any of it. Thomas had heard all of this. He had heard it clearly and understood it completely. And then he had spent 3 years quietly reaching a different conclusion. But to understand why his conclusion was different, why he saw something in Catherine Moran's situation that no one else in that town was willing to see, you first need to understand the one thing that set Thomas apart from every other ambitious man in County Clare. And it was not what anyone expected. There is a question worth asking about any man who succeeds from nothing, and it is not the question most people ask. Most people ask how. How did he get the money? How did he find the opportunity? How did the circumstances align in his favor? These are reasonable questions, and they have answers. But they are not the right question, because the how is always specific to the person and the moment and the particular configuration of luck and timing that can never be perfectly replicated. The right question is what? What was the quality inside him that made the how possible in the first place? What was the thing that, if you could isolate it and understand it and carry it with you, would change the trajectory of your own life the same way it changed his? For Thomas Fitzsimmons, that quality had a name, though he never used it himself. He would not have had the vocabulary for it. But looking back at what he did and how he did it, the pattern is unmistakable. The quality was contrarian patience, the specific, disciplined ability to look at a situation that everyone around him had evaluated and dismissed, and ask not whether their conclusion was wrong, but why their conclusion had been reached so unanimously. Because Thomas had noticed something about consensus that most people never notice. The louder and more universal an agreement is, the more likely it is that no one inside it has actually done the math. People agree quickly on things that feel obvious. And obvious things, Thomas had learned, are almost never as well examined as they feel. Take the Moran textile business. Every merchant in Ennis had looked at the Moran family's debt and reached the same conclusion in approximately the same amount of time, which is to say, very little time at all. The debts were real. Thomas did not dispute this. Patrick Moran, Catherine's father, had borrowed against expansion plans that the market had not cooperated with, and the resulting obligations were significant. But Thomas had done something that none of the established merchants had bothered to do. He had actually read the ledgers, not summarized them, not heard about them second-hand over drinks at the kind of establishment where commercial reputations are made and destroyed in equal measure. He had read them, line by line, with the same careful attention he had applied to every borrowed ledger over the past 3 years. And what he found was not a ruined business. What he found was a mismanaged one. The distinction, to Thomas, was everything. A ruined business has no foundation worth saving. The product is wrong, the market is gone. The core assumption was false from the beginning. A mismanaged business has something real at its center that poor decisions have buried. The Moran textile operation had contracts, long-standing relationships with suppliers, and a product that people in Ennis and the surrounding towns actually wanted and continued to buy, even as the financial structure around it collapsed. The business was not dying because it was weak. It was dying because Patrick Moran had borrowed at the wrong time, at the wrong rate, from the wrong people, and had then compounded this by making the very human mistake of borrowing more to cover the first borrowing rather than cutting costs and consolidating. The debts were large, but the underlying engine, if you cleared the wreckage away from it, was still running. This was the insight that 3 years of deliberate education had made possible. Not intelligence alone. Thomas was sharp, but Ennis was not short of sharp men. Not ambition alone. Ambition was common and cheap, and found in roughly equal measure in successful men and unsuccessful ones. What Thomas had that the others lacked was a framework for evaluation that was independent of social consensus. He had taught himself, painstakingly and without any formal instruction, to separate the question of what people thought about a situation from the question of what the situation actually was. These two things, he had discovered, were frequently very different, and the gap between them, the space between perception and reality, between the story people told and the facts underneath it, was where every genuine opportunity lived. He also understood something about Catherine herself that the men in the cooperative had entirely missed, because they had not been paying attention in the right way. While her father's decisions had driven the business toward collapse, Catherine had been the one managing the supplier relationships, the one maintaining the quality controls, the one keeping the actual production side of the operation functional through years of financial turbulence. She was not the liability. She was, in fact, the only reason the business had survived as long as it had. The men who said waste no time on her had confused the debts with the debtor, the crisis with the person navigating it. They had looked at the smoke and decided the fire was out. Thomas had looked at the fire. And here is the part that should stop you cold, if you are paying attention. Everything Thomas did, the 3 years of reading, the deliberate relationship building, the careful independent analysis of a situation everyone else had written off, none of it required resources he did not have. None of it required connections he was not born with. It required something available to anyone willing to pay the price for it. And the price was not money. The price was time, attention, and the willingness to question a consensus rather than shelter inside it. Can you see what that means? Not for Thomas. For you. The ceiling in your life is built from the same material as the ceiling in his, and the tool that brought it down is already in your hands. In the spring of 1815, Thomas Fitzsimmons walked back through the door of the merchant cooperative in Ennis. Not uninvited this time. Not as the floor sweeper's acquaintance, or the tenant farmer's third son, or the young man with the missing buttons and the accent that made educated men stop listening. He walked in as a prospective business partner with a written proposal, a documented financial plan, and 3 years of accumulated reputation that had preceded him into the room like a herald. The same men who had told each other not to waste their time on him sat across the table and, for the first time, were genuinely uncertain how to categorize him. That uncertainty was, in its own quiet way, the first victory. The proposal was straightforward in its structure and radical in its premise. Thomas offered to take on a portion of the Moran family's outstanding debt, personally, from the small reserve of capital he had accumulated through 3 years of relentless restraint, in exchange for a partnership stake in the restructured business. He presented his analysis of the operation's underlying value, the supplier relationships, the existing customer base, the production capacity, that had been obscured by the financial chaos surrounding it. He spoke in the language of the room, the vocabulary he had borrowed and studied and practiced, until it no longer felt borrowed at all. And when he finished, the silence that followed was a different kind of silence from the one 3 years earlier. Not the silence of dismissal, the silence of men doing arithmetic. They approved the partnership, not unanimously, and not without conditions that were designed, at least in part, to limit his exposure to the cooperative's more established members in the event that he was wrong. But they approved it. And here is what happened next, told without embellishment, because the facts are sufficient on their own. Within 18 months, the restructured Moran business had cleared its primary debts. Within 3 years, it had doubled its production capacity. Within a decade, Thomas Fitzsimmons and Catherine Moran, who married quietly in the autumn of 1815, to the considerable surprise of everyone who had advised against any connection between them, had built the largest textile operation in County Clare, employing over 140 workers and supplying merchants as far as Limerick and Galway. The man nobody had bet on had become, without anyone quite noticing the exact moment it happened, the man everyone pointed to, not as an anomaly, not as a lucky exception, as evidence of something that made the established men of Ennis slightly uncomfortable when they thought about it too carefully, that the evaluation they had conducted on a grey morning in 1812 had not been a rigorous assessment of reality. It had been a social reflex, a consensus masquerading as analysis, and the cost of that reflex, measured in the opportunity they had declined to take, was very large indeed. Now, here is where the story turns and faces you directly, because that is what this story has always been for. Thomas Fitzsimmons was not a genius. The historical record on him is modest. A few commercial documents, a marriage record, a land registry entry from 1823 that lists his holdings with the clipped indifference of bureaucratic notation. He did not reshape nations or command armies or leave behind any philosophy with his name attached to it. He was a man of specific local significance who outthought the room he was born beneath and built something real from the gap between what people assumed and what was actually true. That is all, and that is everything. Because the ceiling he broke was not made of stone. It was made of consensus. It was made of the accumulated agreement of people who had decided, without sufficient examination, that certain outcomes were available to certain people and not to others. And consensus, as Thomas demonstrated with 3 years of quiet, deliberate, unglamorous work, is not a law. It is a habit. Habits can be interrupted. Categories can be questioned. The gap between perception and reality exists in every industry, every market, every social structure you have ever encountered. And it exists right now, in whatever room you are standing beneath, in whatever ceiling you have started to mistake for the sky. The question is not whether you are capable of what Thomas did. You have the same 24 hours. You have access to information he could not have imagined. You have the ability, right now, to identify one consensus in your field or your life that feels universal and ask whether it has actually been examined or whether it has simply been repeated until it achieved the authority of fact. That question costs nothing. It requires no capital, no connections, no inherited advantage. It requires only the willingness to look at what everyone else has agreed to stop looking at. Thomas did not wait 3 years. He worked 3 years. The waiting was just what it looked like from the outside. Waste no time on her, they said. And in saying it, they handed him the only information he needed, that they had already looked away. The most valuable opportunities in any era are the ones that the consensus has decided are not worth the attention. They are available precisely because everyone qualified to take them has been talked out of trying. Thomas understood this at 23 years old, in a cold street in County Clare, with nothing in his hands and everything still ahead of him. The only question left, the one that does not have a historical answer, only a personal one, is what you are going to do with the same understanding, right now, today, before another year becomes 3.